Hello, it's Antonis from TheCollector, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing um, Dr. De Vartavan to discuss about his new book, Locating the Tomb and Body of Alexander the Great. Hello, Christian.
Hello, Antonis. Thank you for having me.
You are an Egyptologist and archaeologist and archaeobotanist.
Yes, as well.
And there are a lot of things, interesting things that someone can read about you and your career. But we are here to talk about your latest research. Um, so why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and how you became interested in Alexander's legacy?
Um, I, First, as you said, I'm an Egyptologist. I started at a very young age. I was 4 or 5 when Egypt uh, caught my attention. And at the time, my family still lived in Alexandria, and it lived in Ibrahimia, which was the Greek quarter. And we lived together with Greeks. And we had been in Alexandria since about 1903. And my grandmother was the last member to die in Alexandria, died in 1992. And I used to spend my youth in Alexandria. For example, in 1980, I spent what was the last Christmas for the Greek community of Alexandria, actually. I remember people throwing glass through the windows straight into the streets on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day, or it was Christmas. I can't remember exactly. So at the time, the topic of the tomb of Alexander the Great was a topic that every Alexandrian family which had an education would discuss at one moment or another. It probably started with my grandfather before the First World War. And my father drew, as an Egyptologist, of course, logically drew my attention to the problem. And that is that the tomb of Alexander the Great had not been yet found by that time and still hasn't been found officially.
Before we get to your research and delve deeper into the topic, could you provide us with some contextual information about how Alexander ended up in Alexandria, how his body ended up in Alexandria, and the circumstances where he was buried?
So, as you know, Alexander died in Babylon. We're not certain what he died of. It was a fever, officially. His body was, according to tradition, not buried for 30 days. So we presume it was embalmed, which it was later on, because there's sources that say that he was embalmed, that is mummified in the manner of the Chaldeans and of the Egyptians, which was they used combined technique to preserve his body. And then the idea was to bring his body back from Babylon all the way to the royal necropolis in Macedonia, in northern Greece. And the preparation of the voyage was prepared by his brother, Philip Arideus, and it was put in a very elaborate carriage that was dragged with several horses and was gilded, and there was all sorts of very, very impressive decorum that was prepared. It was actually put on the road from Babylon all the way to Greece, except around when the carriage arrived in Syria, General Ptolemy had another idea of where the body of Alexander should end, namely, the general idea was the oasis of Siwa, where he was declared the son of Zeus and Ammon. But whatever happened, he body of Alexander all the way to Greece, and he diverted the body all the way to Egypt. So General Perdiccas followed him with an army. Unfortunately, his elephants drowned at Pelusium, which is the frontier of Egypt, and his Channels rebelled against him, and that was the end of the attempt to prevent the body of Alexander the Great to go to Egypt. The body was actually transported further to Memphis, which was the capital of Egypt at the time. And their sources are, diverge of what exactly happened. Some some classic sources said that the high priest of the temple of Memphis actually asked for the body to be transported to Alexandria. But in effect, it's more likely that it stayed for a while in the capital of Egypt, in Memphis, under Ptolemy I, Soter. And it's only under his successor, Ptolemy II Philadelphos, that actually it was taken to Alexandria. Why was it taken to Alexandria? It's very logical. Alexandria was one of the many cities that Alexander the Great had created across the whole of the Middle East. And but this one was the one which Ptolemy the First Soter had inherited as a general. He had inherited the kingdom of Egypt. So he wanted to have the body of the founder of the city with him to legitimate his power, to be close to the man he had served for a long time, and who was, of course, one of the greatest heroes of all time, military heroes of all time. So what they did, like any Greek city or Roman city, the classical city was organized as per with two avenues crossing each other, one called the Cardo in Latin and the Decumanus, which was the one perpendicular. In Greek, I don't know what the names are, what you may tell me. But the tradition was that the hero, the founder of the city, would always be buried at the crossroad of the two roads, usually on the agora. And well, this is probably most likely where there was some upstream, there's no mystery. And it's the shape it took, the disposition it had is, of course, a matter of debate. But I'll let you ask, some more questions before I expand.
In your book, you argue that the body, the sarcophagus, and the tomb are three different things, and we should look for each of them separately. Why is that?
Well, originally, of course, all parts were together in at the place where he was buried. So if there was the soma was a tumulus, then the mausoleum would have been in the tumulus, and then the sarcophagus of Alexander would have been in the mausoleum, and the body would have been in the sarcophagus. Some tradition says that the sarcophagus was made of glass. As a matter of fact, it was probably alabaster or something the like, through which one could see the body, or at least distinguish the body of Alexander. Of course, the body with time would decay, but there are sources and traditions that many Roman emperors actually saw the body of Alexander. And in some cases, there were incidents where his nose was broken, when his breastplate was taken, the chest collapsed. So as time went by, of course, the body would not be in the perfect state. Add to this that there was embalming material on top of him. Well, maybe just seeing him through without seeing him would have been a good idea. Now, because, with time, the city expanded, and the Cumanus, actually the main avenue that was towards the east, towards the west, moved towards the east. That is what actually my book reveals, and that the thought before is that where Pacta Costa is actually excavating right now and looking for the foundation of the tomb of Alexander. As a matter of fact, she doesn't need to, because she is right. The alabaster mausoleum, which is now further east, was most likely the mausoleum of Alexander the Great. It was Achille Adriani, who was an Italian who in the 40s, 50s had first formulated this idea. But then if the mausoleum was in the tumulus, and that's something my book show, it was in the hill because it existed until the 19th century, then when there was the erosion of the hill, the mausoleum would stay exactly where it is today. So where we see the actual alabaster museum today at the crossroad the new crossroad, 2 kilometers east, where it is in the garden today, is most likely where it's always been. And many people were right to think that such elaborate structure made of alabaster was probably a royal tomb. And I do believe it's exactly that. It can't be a coincidence that the first mausoleum that was at the earlier crossroad, that at the time of Ptolemy the second Philadelphus, was, then when it was moved, of course, they transported this a very elaborate alabaster mausoleum, but they recreated the same Macedonian tomb, exactly the same sort of tomb we have in Casta in northern Greece, which we found, some years ago, and it was a very big moment for Greece to the tomb of Casta. He was buried. The sources says he was buried in the manner of a Macedonian. So we're not to expect a Egyptian tomb. We're to expect a Greek tomb in its form. So a tumulus in which the chamber would have been inserted. And by the way, Adriani rightly pointed out that the outer part of the alabaster mausoleum that we have in Alexandria today is not polished, only the inside. Why? Because if they embedded it in a tumulus, there was no need to waste time in polishing it. So that's also an argument to think that this. Another argument is that a lot of tombs found in Alexandria are reproduced with painting the malachite type of pattern that this alabaster has. This sort of circles that you find on malachite exist in the mausoleum which is now in Alexandria. And that's most probably because people wanted to refer to the tomb of Alexandria. They wanted to refer to the tomb of someone who was very important. And that argument was formulated some years ago. So what is important to understand, there is not one, in terms of the tomb, forget about the sarcophagus and forget about the body. In terms of the tomb, there has been 2 locations in ancient time in Alexandria. One, the original one towards the eastern gate of the city, the western gate of the city, and one in later times near the eastern gate. Why? Because the decumanus, the new decumanus that had been shifted eastward, led to the palace of Cleopatra and of the later Ptolemies, and it was very logical that down the perspective they wanted to see the tumulus of the founder of the city, someone that everybody talked about and referred to for hundreds of years, so it's perfectly logical. Yes.
We discussed a bit about the history of Alexander's body and tomb in antiquity, but also a big part of your work and research has to do with Islamic sources.
Yeah.
Which are also fascinating and very interesting, and we don't hear a lot about them usually. So how did the Islamic world perceive Alexander?
He was very significant in Islam, and he is still very significant in Islam. To say important is there's a very delicate boundary there. But in the Muslim world, Alexander is regarded as a wise prophet. And the shift from a conqueror to that position was not one that happened overnight. It was an evolution which started by the fact that he went to the oasis of Siwa and was named in antiquity as the son of Ammon and the heir of Ammon and Zeus. And therefore, he started to be represented on the Ptolemaic stater, which was the big coins with horns. And when the Arabs conquered Egypt in 640 AD, that was Ibn Amr al-As and his Muslim horsemen, they saw these coins and they asked who this person was, and they all there was already a tradition, and they called him Tul Karnaim. Karnaim, like in French, corne means horn. He became the bicornet, the one with the double horns, and these horns were, of course, those of Ammon, those representing the divinity of Ammon, the very same his expression as a ram that you found in Karnak, but also that would be represented in later period of history. So Alexander becomes Zulkarnain, and Mohammed knew about Alexander, and in one of the surat, he actually mentioned Zulkarnain, and knew very well that he was the Greek conqueror. For many centuries, there was a big debate among Islamic scholars of why a pagan conqueror would become part of Islam. But with time, they reconciliated the fact that he was extremely wise. He was a great conqueror. He had created Alexandria, which in Arabic became Iskandaria, which is the way they call it. And they assigned to him a great amount of wisdom, and his legend, through the romance of Alexander, which was written by an author called the Pseudo Callisthenes. Callisthenes lived in the time of Alexander, but there was a historian who told the story of Alexander as a romance, and this romance of Alexander penetrated the Islamic world, spread across the entire Islamic world. And if you look in my book, one of the things I was extremely interested to publish in this book is a very late, I think the date was the 17th century or 18th century manuscript from Timbuktu, which still exists in Timbuktu, which is an Arabic translation of the romance of Alexander, and which is now in Mali. And as opposed, in the very famous library of Timbuktu. At the opposite end, you will find that whether it's in Yemen, on the way to India, Alexander is represented in an array of Islamic manuscripts, looking for the fountain of life, doing all sorts of deeds. His story is told, and that you will find also in the book. I have found some of the rarest and most beautiful Islamic, photograph of pages of these Islamic manuscripts, which show Alexander not as a Greek, but actually as an Arab or as someone of the Muslim world of India. Why? Because it was their way of understanding of how Alexander was, and they had no points of reference at the time in the Middle Ages or later. So it was there. But the legend persisted, whether it's in the Shahnameh in Persia or his presence lingers and is still part of Islam. I can't remember exactly right now the name of the surat. It's the surat of the cow, I think, where he is actually mentioned. But it's a very, whatever is in the Quran. You're not talking about the hadiths, that is the commentaries of the Quran. You're talking about the Quran itself, and that makes him present, which is a very rare situation. And at one point, there was even a big argument if he was a Hilmiya, if there was a Himyar king or who was Tulkarnain, but ultimately everything was reconciliated. Now, where the Islamic sources are important for this research is actually this is how you can validate the fact that the Mosque Nabi Daniel is on top of the Soma. And that is really an original part, extremely original part of my research, because for nobody until the book I've written had asked why there would be a mosque of Daniel at a place where Alexander was supposedly buried. Add to this that not only there is a Daniel buried in the crypt of the mosque, but there is another character of the Quran called Luqman who is also buried there. The problem is that both of them predate Alexander, and in fact are from antiquity. Luqman is from about 1000 BC, and Daniel the same. And yet both of them are buried there with tombs which are not orientated towards Mecca. That's a very important thing. This is what the Service of Antiquities of Alexandria. When they opened the tombs some decades ago, they were stupefied to see that these tombs were not pointing towards Mecca, which suggests to them that they predate, So nobody had asked the question of what is the relation between Daniel and Alexander, and why would there be a gentleman called Luqman, who was a very wise person as well, actually in tradition, in the very same place. I've asked myself this question for a long time, did a lot of research, and ultimately, I think I have found the answer to the question, because in India, there is a Arabic manuscript called the Kitab al-Tijan, or the Book of Crowns. It has never, ever been translated in any Western language. I had to obtain a copy and have it translated by the Islamic department of the Collège de France in Paris. It was a task. And this book reveals the most unexpected of correlation. not only Daniel is connected to Lokman, but the two are connected to Zulkarnain, that is Alexander the Great. And why is that? Because they are all three of them minor but very wise prophets in the Islamic world. So suddenly you have a book which not only mentions Daniel, who, by the way, announced the coming of Alexander. There was a prophecy there. But on top of that, within the same paragraph, actually aligns all three of them. Could this be a coincidence? Most likely not. Are they buried in the mosque? Most likely not either. Because the tomb of Daniel is supposedly in Mosul, and that of Lokman, we're not sure where it is. But the sure thing is they're all very wise, and it's very possible that ultimately Islam wanted to associate the tombs of these two prophets with another one, which is part of the Quran as such. You see, this explanation has never been provided. Of course, everything is possible, and coincidences are possible. But I think it's a very, very difficult coincidence to make. So that points actually, because the association, to the fact that the Mosque of Nabi Daniel is really at the vertical of where it used to be, or at least nearby where the tumulus of Alexander used to be.
In your book, you describe visiting the mosque in 1996, and back then it would have been it was different than it is now. Very different. Visited myself, but could you tell us what you saw there, how it looked like, and what may be different now?
Well, now the mosque has been renovated. There has been some funds which have actually installed a staircase, and you can go down into the crypt. In 1996, this was not the case at all. You still had the well with the crypt, which is the floor of the ancient Christian chapel transformed in an Islamic chapel. It is in a cruciform shape, literally. It's exactly like some very early 5th century Christian chapel found in Ravenna or, at the Byzantine areas, and or in Syria, for that matter, very, very early. And to go in there, you had to take a ladder. First, you needed to have a permission. So I actually had the permission. I had an inspector of the Service of Antiquities to accompany me and my team at the time. And we went down with the ladder at the bottom, in the crypt, really. A crypt that you could reach from the street once upon a time, thanks to stairs. Now the entrance is wall. The oratory, the small chapel that is described by an array of travelers across time, whether it's Marmol or a Polish nobleman or many others, was entered from the street. Now you can't enter from the street like the Christian Pommery chapel was entered a long time ago. You can only go down from the mosque to the crypt. So there was, at the time, only a ladder. And the reason I wanted to go at the bottom of the crypt is because there is a little door on the, I think it's the northwestern side of the crypt. And this leads to a very ancient cistern, which is much below, about 10 meters or more below the floor of the ancient chapel. And like many cisterns in Alexandria, because the entire city actually functioned with cisterns, but this one has been preserved. And the reason I wanted to see this is because in the 30s, there was an Italian archaeologist called Brescia who said he was excavating in the Mosque Nabi Daniel. And at the time in Alexandria, it was border hysteria. I mean, literally, the Brescia had great trouble pursuing his work because archaeology, like also the sources of the Nile and other such topics in those, pre-Second World War periods, there was a real passion for the topic. So the press was following, and it was very difficult for him to work in normal conditions. But the sure thing is, the report that he produced didn't, in any circumstance, establish, unlike what he said, whether or not the tomb was below the mosque. And this is where the book brings other elements. As a matter of fact, if you do not obtain a certain report that has been made by Professor Mikhailowski of the Polish Center of Mediterranean Archaeology, you cannot conclude anything as to whether or not the tomb of Alexander is below the Mosque of Nebi Daniel. And you know what? This report is nearly impossible to obtain. I had to ask Barbara Tsakow in Poland in the 90s, who had discovered the report, integrated in her new PhD, for her to make me a copy and send it to me. Why? Because it's published in the bulletin of the faculty of the university, the Faculty of Archaeology, University of Alexandria. Mikhailovsky and his team decided to publish there after they went in the Mosque Nebi Daniel and attempted to validate what Brescia had done. If you don't have this report, you cannot finish the job about concluding whether Nebi Daniel or not is the place. And a lot of people say it is not the Mosque of Nebi Daniel. Well, if you don't have this report, if you don't read what Mikhailovsky has written, you cannot draw any conclusions. But once you have it, and I'm a field archaeologist, it takes me 10 minutes to realize a very simple thing. Nobody has excavated at the vertical of the Mosque Nebi Daniel. Brescia looked in the cistern down, which is on the edge. The actual earth volume, which is below the mosque, has never been excavated to this day, period. So you cannot say whether the tomb is there or not. It may not be, because if it was a tumulus, the tumulus has eroded, and maybe we would find some foundation possibly, but I don't think so. I think what the Islamic tradition and the previous traditions reported, that this is where the original tumulus of the tomb of Alexander was. But when they removed the mausoleum, the alabaster one, which we find, well, they removed it, and it was embedded in the Macedonian type of tumulus, and they moved it 2 miles down, 2 kilometers down, where it is today. So I'm not sure we'll ever find anything. But until such time as we excavate this area, and at one point there was even a chance to do it, because as Professor Mikhailovsky said, at one point the royal tombs that were actually buried in Alexandria, Said Pasha and other kings of Egypt, if you wish, of the time, had been moved to Cairo, where they are now. So there was an opportunity when their private mausoleum was removed to excavate it, but this was not done. So the question of what is below Nebi Daniel is unanswered. But the logic, if we follow the logic, then the mausoleum, we talked about paths. The mausoleum was moved eastward, and then later on, the Soma was destroyed. And that brings us to another period, that is the Christian period, because it's during the Christian period that the second Soma disappears. That is not only not only the mausoleum or the body of Alexander disappear at that time, but in fact the tombs of the Ptolemies themselves completely disappear. So if you want to ask me another question, or I can pursue on in that direction.
I would like to recap your hypothesis, basically, which is that the second Soma was moved, and due to the
body, not the mausoleum, the body. We're talking, since the mausoleum is there, the body was removed. Yes.
Okay, which is another topic, the Soma and the Sema. And
because Soma in exactly. That's a big problem too. Soma in Greek is the body and tomb. Absolutely, very correct. Yes.
So you suggest that it was moved approximately to the area where the Mosque Nabi is, and in Mosque Nabi, one will find Prophet Daniel and
Lokman, who are still buried in the crypt. Yes. This is Islamic period.
And there is a connection between these two persons and Alexander the Great that you found through your research.
Yes.
And it would make sense that they would be buried in one space where
the tradition. Yes.
Yes. So
this says it was. But we have to distinguish.
Was excavate at the cistern, at the lowest level of the Mosque Nabi, the Nabi Daniel Mosque. And how easy would it be for someone to then permission to excavate there if you know
Almost,
inside yourself.
almost impossible. Almost impossible. Any religious building in Egypt is under the control of an institution called the Waqf, and they almost never gave any authorization. And in fact, the last time, as I remember, I mean, the official so-called permit to excavate Nabi Daniel was given to Brescia because he knew King Fuad, and King Fuad and Prince Omar Toussoun pushed it so hard that the Waqf, in front of a royal demand, had to concede. But in effect, he was not allowed at all to excavate below. He excavated the sand, and in fact, he didn't excavate anything at all. No, it's almost impossible. But I think at that stage, since the mausoleum, we think that the one in the alabaster mausoleum, which is now where Papa Costa is excavating, that is in the garden, which is not far from the Armenian cemetery and other cemeteries. Since it's moved there, the question now becomes more what has become of the body. And this is the most original part, of course, of my research. It's one which I owe to another Armenian who is a Greek citizen called George Kyotsian. He used to work as an epigraphist in the Byzantine department of the Collège de France. As you know, the Collège de France is one of the highest research institutions of France. In fact, the highest, technically speaking. And when I was doing the research on looking for the tomb and body Alexander, he remembered a very old Byzantine tradition whereby was represented on the walls of a number of Greek monasteries, including in the Meteors or Halkidiki, and also on some icons, some preserved in Venice or in Russia, in St. Petersburg, a scene where you had a father of the desert, an Egyptian father of the desert called Sisoes, leaning over the skeletal remains of Alexander. And the fact that it's Alexander is clearly indicated. You have Alexandros written on the wall. This scene is on certain monasteries. And of course, it was of great interest to me when he pointed that. But we were in the pre-internet era, so nobody knew about this tradition. And George and I started to look for evidence concerning this legend, what it was about. So on top of that, the relief is you don't only see Sisoes as an Egyptian desert father leaning over Alexander, but there is a text which is assigned to John Damascena, who lived in the 15th, 16th century, a poem whereby Sisoes I can't remember the exact wording, but basically what he says, he said, look, Alexander, how you are now, and look, you who were a great, conqueror, and this is the faith that is waiting for all of us. So glory is futility, and this is what will happen to all of us ultimately. And this is why that scene was represented across all the monasteries of Greece. It was to remind the monks of the vanity of life and the imminence of death. And you may be the greatest conqueror in the world, you will share the same fate as all of us. This is why that scene was represented. Now, the thing is, when we looked in the Greek sources, the Byzantine sources, we actually had real problems finding a biography of Sisoes, but ultimately we did. And we had some information, and correlating this information with some Coptic sources, we were able to establish the following. Sisoes was born in the southern part of Egypt during the 4th century AD, and he was born in Upper Egypt, and very young, he moved to the mountain of Saint Anthony. He stayed in the area of the mountains of Saint Anthony for 72 years. And when he arrived, the monastery itself was just being built. And he stayed in as a hermit, and I don't know if he moved in the monastery at a later period, during a later period. But what is very interesting that past these 72 years, he finished the very last years of his life north, a bit further north than Suez in Egypt. And yet, the tradition is that he actually saw the body of Alexander. So, if you correlate the we know that the under Theodosius and before him Benjamin, that is the Coptic Patriarch of Alexandria, the pagan monuments of Alexandria were destroyed. The Serapeum, which is the great temple, was leveled, and the bodies of the Ptolemies and of Alexander the Great disappear exactly at that time. And this date coincides exactly, that period coincides exactly with the period during which Sisoes was in the monastery or in the area of the monastery of St. Anthony. So, if, it's like cross-correlating not only time, but places and tradition. Now, the thing is, what I think the Greek government should do now, concerning my theory and the possibility that the body of Alexander is in the vicinity of the monastery or in the monastery. That is, it could be in Necropolis, outside the monastery or even inside, because there are traditions sometimes that some skeletal remains are kept under altars or that sort of thing. If I was the Greek government, I would actually write a letter to the actual Pope of the Coptic Church, and that's Theodoros, I think, right now. And I would ask a simple question. Because the scriptures are vast, the Coptic scriptures are vast, do you have any tradition that the body of Alexander has ever been housed in the monastery of St. Anthony or any other monastery? And if the question would be no, the answer would be no, I think the Greek government could accompany this question with another and said, could you please help us identify the original text that talks about Sisoes? Because the Codex 303 of Constantinople actually alludes that the famous poem that is seen on the walls of the monasteries is not by Damascena, is not by John Damascena, it was by Sisoes himself. And that Coptic text has not yet been found. Finding that text could help us, correlate or identify or obtain more information about the becoming of the body of Alexander the Great. So that's what I would suggest, personally.
Why should we think that his myth is more than a story that served this function to remind to the monks the futility of power and money and all that, and that actually holds some value to the search for Alexander's body. It makes there is some correlation in the time, as you described it. But is there more evidence to suggest that this theory
Is valid.
is more than a myth? Yes.
Yeah. For the time being, we have a correlation of we have history that says that the body of Alexander and that of the Ptolemies disappeared during the 4th century. That's one. Second, we have a Byzantine tradition that says that the Desert Father has actually seen the body of Alexander in his lifetime in St. Anthony, actually. One of the sources says in St. Anthony. And that tradition actually was used for theological and philosophical purposes across an array of Orthodox monasteries, not only in Greece, but probably outside, since there are other icons which are found beyond. Okay. And third, we have, through the Coptic sources, an actual very precise biography of this Desert Father. It just happens that he spent 90% of his lifetime, at a single place. So I would say we have some elements which put together, seem to make sense. What we do not have yet is a text that seems to be the original one talking about that story, from which the Byzantine tradition is probably inspired, because Byzantine Orthodox, like in Mount Athos or in Halkidiki, there's a covenant for nuns. They knew about the Coptic sources. They were extremely educated, and they were able to transform this in Synaxarions and other, such calendars. They were able to mention Sisoe. So there's great knowledge. There's a body of knowledge that seems to escape us right now, and we need to find that. And also, we need to, by simply asking simple questions sometimes, like, is there a tradition that Alexander has ever been preserved by the Coptic Church? The Coptic texts are vast. You need a deep and profound knowledge of them to be able to cover, they haven't been scanned yet. You don't have a search facility with internet. You're talking of Synaxaria, you're talking about encyclopedias, you're talking about collations of text on the thousands and thousands of pages. We need help. We need help to be able to identify further texts. And of course, should a body of any body pointed at, that is, if there would be a skeleton that would come out with a supposed possibility that it would be Philip's son, that is Alexander himself, then it would not be complicated to identify, for simple reasons that he was covered in wounds from top to toe, literally. And in particular, he had 3 specific wounds, made each time by 2 smaller arrows and 1 large one. He got an arrow in the foot. I think it was at the siege of Samarkand. He got a large arrow in the breastplate that was in India. And I can't remember right now where he got the 3rd one from, and where it landed. But this sort of scar would leave a very prominent. These sort of wounds would leave prominent scars in the flesh, but in the bone. And on top of that, even though someone pointed out the other day that we do not yet have the DNA of Philip that was found in Pella, or in the Royal Acropolis Vigila, we would be able to probably extract this DNA and compare it to that skeleton should we find that skeleton. What are the chances to succeed in doing this? Very remote, as a matter of fact, because by the time the body of Alexander disappears from Alexandria, already 700 years have elapsed. Add to this another 1700 years, this is where we are now. We're talking of a body who has 2,300 years. What is the likelihood that we find him as a mummy? Almost none. Personally, I think the representation on the bas-relief of the monasteries actually supports even, the fact that Sisoe saw the body, because by the time he would have seen the body, by the time they would have carried him from Alexandria to St. Anthony through the desert road, I can't imagine that the body would have been intact. It would have been decomposed and exactly represented as shown on the bas-relief. They could have represented a mummy, or they could have represented a body that was a better preserved. They deliberately chose to represent a skeleton, but then we also have to take in consideration that in ancient iconographies, the skeleton is a symbol of death. So, like the skull for pirates or that sort of thing. So we have to be very careful. But I would say that it is very likely that should we have the chance to recover Alexander's remains, we would probably find him exactly in that state.
Seems very weird when looking at a city like Alexandria, founded by Alexander, which has a relationship with Alexander since its birth. And even until today, I visit Alexandria and everyone talks about Iskander, and it feels like there is this connection between the people and the history. It feels very strange that a prominent monument like the tomb and the body the relocation could have been forgotten throughout.
It hasn't been. They still remember where it is. That's the thing. Yeah. But the fact that it was destroyed, you see, before Theodosius when the Coptic patriarch decided, the previous one, Benjamin, I think, was to destroy the pagan monument. Christian had been persecuted for a long time. And then when, of course, the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, then it was a time to have a sort of revenge. And there was not a day when a party of Christians would go and destroy one Egyptian temple in the Delta, the Serapeum, of course, which was hailed as a victory of Christianity over paganism. It was a big thing, the destruction of it. In my book, you can see a representation. I think it was a Theodosius standing on the ruins of the Serapeum as a triumph. And of course, the Ptolemies, they may have shoveled them in the corner, but Alexander had such an aura. We can imagine that destroying the body of Alexander, even for a Coptic or a Christian patriarch and its church, would have been a very, very, very big decision. So sending it far away from Alexandria, where his influence, imagine, he's not even in Alexandria anymore, and we still talk about him. Imagine if Alexander was still in Alexandria, if his body was still in full view, he would dominate the scene. Of course he would, and he still does. So there is a form of logic of sending him outside of Alexandria at a critical time. You have to remember that at that time there were violent conflicts. Hypatia, you remember Hypatia, what happened to her? She was torn to pieces by Christians, and who couldn't believe that a Greek woman could be so learned and so intelligent and that sort of thing. There were very, very tense moments in the history of Alexandria with a lot of bloodshed. Well, if I was a patriarch of Alexandria, I would have removed Alexander, let's say, from Alexandria, but I would not have destroyed him. Now, the chances, if he has been brought to the monastery of St. Anthony such a long time ago, the Coptic Church itself may have forgotten about the fact that he is buried somewhere, or not. After all, very often we do not ask simple questions because we do not evolve in the same spheres. Byzantinologists, study Byzantine texts, and Coptologists study Coptic texts. It's quite rare that there's a common work for a common goal, because there are different eras. It's a bit like Egyptologists. Most Egyptologists have no idea of how the Coptic language functions. And I'm well, placed for that because I deal with the vocalization of ancient Egyptian, and it's precisely that. But just looking over the fence sometime, asking the right simple questions can yield some extraordinary results. But again, it was a long time ago. It was a long, long time ago. Anything could have happened even to the tomb. Let's say even if the tomb was a monastery, it could have been disturbed across time by so many additional events of people who visited it. The advantage of monastery, though, is that, things tend to stay as they are. And that is one of the advantages of churches. I mean, Jerusalem, in our Armenian monastery, we're said to have James, that is Jesus's brother, under the altar. Literally, I've sat there because I was the guest of the patriarch in 1988, and I'm invited again to go. In fact, when things will be a bit calmer in Jerusalem and Israel. But yes, James is supposed to be under the altar. Maybe Alexander is somewhere in if not the monastery of St. Anthony, maybe in another monastery, because there's also the possibility that, maybe Sissoes did one trip to another local monastery. And if that's where the interest of finding the original biography or the original text that triggered this tradition in the Greek monasteries with this famous poem needs to be recovered. And that I can tell you, I'm almost 100% sure that it exists somewhere. But it's a professional's job. So yes, the Greek government could start with that, or simply write and ask, is it there or is it not? Or do you have any any legend that the body would have been carried into the Eastern Desert?
Do you think that the Greek government has a sort of a duty to continue the research and
Well, it's very important for Greece, of course. And in this respect, you know my affection for Greece. I arrived in Greece when I was 16. There's not, as an Armenian, there is not a place in Greece, from Halkidiki to Athens and Heraklion or Elunda or Ios Nikolaos, where every time I have said I'm an Armenian, that the Greek doors didn't open. It's simple as that. And that is this is not just a kind remark. It's just a fact. It is what I'm 60 now. For more than four decades, every single time I've been to Greece, I've been welcomed with open arms everywhere. Well, I would be delighted to help and allowing Greece to find Alexander's body. This is one of beyond the intellectual interest. There's a big piece of affection for Greece, where I do spend a lot of time, by the way.
I think we're running out of time. We've been talking for almost an hour now. Thank you very much for talking about your book, explaining your research. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
It is a pleasure. Of course, it's a pleasure. And I hope that I've given a head start to Greece for quite a long time now. And I think I know some Greek researcher must have learned about it, because when I was the director of the Armenian Egyptology Center in the Republic of Armenia, I got a message from a convention on Alexander that took place in Pella, informing me that the convention was taking place. And I never knew who sent me that email. But I think some people had. And in fact, George told me that when I published the original article in the bulletin of the Academy of Sciences of Armenia, that was in the 90s, Athens, the Academy of Athens called the Collège de France and said, "How far is he?" Well, I was already perhaps ahead, but now I would say, go ahead, just follow the leads. The chance that we discover him is 1 in 1,000, perhaps. But is it not worth trying to get all the way down and use that last chance we have maybe to find him? If we do, well, that would be wonderful.
I think that's the perfect way to close the interview.
Well, thank you, Antonis, and thank you for having me to discuss the topic.